Hello. Upset prevention recovery training. It's 90%, probably more, about prevention, actually. It's about deploying your non-technical competencies, your monitoring, your communication, maintaining your situational awareness, obviously, and perhaps above all, your decision-making, to avoiding an upset occurring in the first place. When it comes to upset recovery training, there's two essential elements. One is the practical ability to physically recover the aircraft from its unusual attitude.
So there's the stall warner coming on at 64. Turn it off. There's the sloppy controls. There's the buffet. There's the nose drop. Thank you very much. Push, roll, power.
But the other is the ability to recover psychologically from the event itself. The most acute psychological effect, arguably, of an upset is that of startle and surprise. Startle and surprise can be not just incapacitating, but actually completely debilitating to the pilot involved in an upset. So the question is why? Well, I always like to start with the bad news, folks. Human beings can't fly. We're not naturally evolved to fly. There are lots of things that human beings do that we're actually not naturally evolved to do. In fact, anything that goes beyond dwelling in caves and hunting and gathering our food is arguably beyond our natural capabilities, but we can and we do, and it's thanks to this extraordinary device, which we call the brain. Now, we don't have to be neurologists, fortunately, to understand this. We really only need to be able to divide it into three basic parts. Now, this first part here we call the input, the prefrontal area, but every animal that has a brain has an input. That's simply where we gather data about the world around us through the media of our senses. Then the data has to go for collation and storage and processing into this area. Now, I call it the human brain, not because only humans have a cortex. Any animal with a brain has some sort of processing unit. But the human brain seems to have a unique characteristic of imagination, the capacity to imagine alternative realities, even things that don't necessarily exist in our universe. And it's that enables us to solve problems in a way that no other animal can. And it's why we can do this very, very unnatural thing of flying, only because we've got this section of the brain. But we've also got a bunch of other stuff that's part of our brain. Indeed, it's worth remembering that we are 99% genetically similar to the chimpanzee, which is why this bit I tend to call, and I'm not the only one, the chimp brain. That's all the automatic processes that go on when we're not actively thinking about things with our conscious, imaginative, creative human brain. The major thing for our purposes here that this does for us is it protects the animal body, as it were, against threat. If I detect an imminent threat to my survival, it's no good waiting for the human brain to perceive the facts, imagine an alternative reality, and come up with a solution to that particular problem. We would not have survived. No, it's the chimp brain that responds to a threat. That response is automatic and instantaneous, and it takes the form of stress. Stress is primarily a physical response. Adrenaline and cortisol, amongst other things, flow into the bloodstream. The muscles tighten, various internal organs function. The body is prepared for fight or flight. But then the question is it fight or flight? Do we attack the threat or run away from the threat, or indeed something else entirely? Well, that depends on the emotional reaction. The chimp brain, whilst preparing the body, will also initiate an automatic emotional response, typically something like anxiety in this case. Prepared for fight or flight, we elect flight, and we are induced to run away from the threat. It's a perfectly natural, automatic response. It has kept us alive for our entire evolutionary history. Now, it might not be anxiety. It might be that the appropriate behaviour is to attack the threat rather than to run away, in which case anger would be our automatic emotional response, or it might be withdrawal, retire, as it were, to the back of the cave, wait for the situation to change, and that would be depression, sadness. But some varied combination of these automatic emotional responses generated by the chimp brain is designed to compel behaviour that keeps us alive, which works fine provided we restrict ourselves to behaviour for which we are naturally involved. But we insist as human beings on doing things that are unnatural. Often we will see aircraft accidents, and sometimes our first instinct is to go, if you like, why did the pilots do something so stupid? Well, I might counter with the question, why were a bunch of cave-dwelling hunter-gatherers attempting to fly? It's a very, very unnatural thing that we do. And in these unnatural contexts of the modern world, the chimp brain-inspired behaviour is likely to be unhelpful. We will act against our own best interests. We will say afterwards, what on earth was I thinking? And probably there is no better or more acute example than in the case of surprise, and in particular, startle. There is a difference between surprise and startle, which we'll come on to in a moment. Let's reimagine then this model of the brain as three separate sections, all in need of resources. Here's the human brain. The human brain needs a certain amount of activity in order to do what we need it to do, think about things, make decisions. The chimp brain, of course, though, is keeping us alive, so there's always a demand for resources there, which limits the resources available to our human brain. That's fine as long as there's enough left in there to enable us to do what we want to do. For our purposes, that's to fly. This is the minimum level of resource required for human flight, if you like. Meanwhile, over here, the input is gathering data. New data will come in to the input. We're creating a demand for resources over here, which cannot be met by diverting resources from the chimp brain, because it's keeping us alive, so we instead divert resources away from the human brain and process this new information. Now, one of the ways of increasing the speed of this process is that the human brain creates expectations. And this is doing it all the time. When I blink, for that brief moment while my eyes are shut, the human brain is creating an expectation as to what the world will look like when I open them again. Provided that data is as expected, I can quickly process it, reducing the demand, redeploy the resources to where I need them to be in my thinking, clever, creative human brain. But it's an ongoing process. New data comes in, it's as expected, tick, process, move on. New data, as expected, processed, move on. This is the origin of things like bias. We talk about confirmation bias, for example. We talk about seeing what you expect to see rather than what you actually see. We might even label that as complacency. It isn't really, it's just neurological efficiency. However, every once in a while, new data arrives which is different from our expectations, and it cannot be processed quickly and creates a much bigger demand for resources in my input, which will take the resources available to the human brain below the minimum level required to do what we need to do. And this we call a surprise. A surprise is simply that, where the incoming information is different from what we expected it to be, and requires extra resources from the human brain to process the new information. And it might not be completely incapacitating, but it will certainly affect our faculties for a little bit whilst we deal with it. Now, in traditional simulator-based training, a surprise is very difficult to recreate. In fact, in the old days, where you're simply given a list of things that are going to happen to you, there's no surprise there whatever, really. But even in the more modern setting, where you might give an unexpected event to a crew, it's not entirely unexpected. There are two fundamental differences between simulator training and aircraft training. And one is that you climb into a simulator knowing that something is going to go wrong. You know something's going to happen. So nothing is entirely unexpected. Of course, the other fundamental difference is that the thing is bolted to the ground. And deep down you know that. Deep down you know you're not in any physical danger.
What we were talking about before is I've done all sorts of crazy things in the simulator, but it doesn't do G. Well, it definitely doesn't do G. It doesn't do real issues. No, there is real risk up here. Well, that's bad. It's real. So, like I said before, the sim is just a sim. The worst thing that happens is you fail it.
Absent then is that thing that moves a surprise into a full-on startle, and that is the element of fear. That automatic emotional response that occurs when an animal, a ground-dwelling primate, suddenly finds itself in the air, above the surface of the Earth. By way of example, we'll look at Colgan Air Flight 3407. This is the Dash 8 Q400 that crashed in upstate New York in the early part of 2009. Now, it's worth mentioning for the uninitiated, the Q400 has a full 3-axis autopilot, but no auto throttle. So when it levels off automatically with your hands off the controls, you still need to manually add power in order to maintain the airspeed, which didn't happen in this case. It is fair to say, I think, that the upset prevention skills and competencies were not fully manifest by the crew in question, and there are a number of reasons that's true. But this was the moment right before the incipient start of the event, before the startling moment that was about to occur. And the data coming in to this pilot's input are fairly normal. It doesn't bear close scrutiny with your concentrating cognitive human brain, but to the input this is pretty much as expected. Nothing is announcing itself as unusual. 1 second later, and all hell breaks loose. The airspeed drops into the low speed queue, the airspeed indicator itself goes red. The stick shaker turns on, which rattles the control column in the pilot's hands and creates an almighty noise. It's like a machine gun going off in there, and simultaneously disconnects the autopilot, which is also accompanied by a loud, repetitive, blaring tone and a big red flashing light. In other words, an awful lot of unexpected new information has just arrived in its pilot's brain that needs processing. This is a very big surprise. But at the same time, this has happened in real life, airborne above the surface of the Earth. This chimp brain experiences that as a threat to life and responds accordingly, as billions of years' worth of evolved instinct will instruct it to do. Stress begets fear. This, in addition to the demand from the input, creates a demand for resources from the chimp brain. We must meet that demand because the chimp brain keeps us alive. So resources will shuttle over there, and now the pilot is completely incapacitated. For at least 2 to 4 seconds, a startled pilot goes from being a human being flying an aeroplane to a primitive chimp primate finding itself suspended above the surface of the Earth. Now, everyone here at Ultimate High knows, and if you don't know, the instructors will tell you, the correct thing to do to recover either the incipient stall or an actual stall, and that is to push the stick forward. Indeed, we can probably sum up the techniques for most recovery from unusual attitudes by simply saying, push first.
Cover now. Push, roll, power, stabilize.
And then, having unloaded the wings, reduce the angle of attack, make sure the aircraft is actually flyable, then you can set about righting the attitude. But that's the human brain telling you that. That's the knowledge stored up there in the human brain. The chimpanzee doesn't know that. All the chimpanzee knows is that it's suspended above the ground and that the ground will hurt it, maybe even kill it. The natural instinct is to withdraw from the threat, to pull away from the threat. Hundreds of hours of flight training tells every pilot in the world that the way to avoid the ground is to pull back, so of course that's what the pilot does. When you think about it, if you're in trouble in an aircraft, pushing forward is pretty counterintuitive. We don't want to be relying on our intuition in these situations. But the chimp brain, unfortunately, doesn't do inaction. It says, do something now. And so we pull back on the stick. And now, of course, that doesn't work.
You're pulling back. It's not saving me. Pulling back and nothing's happening. push, roll, power. Save light.
Because it doesn't work, the human brain would say, okay, select option B. But the chimp brain says, it's not working, increase panic. More stress and an increase in fear. And the brain also automatically starts to cast around and look for the source of the threat. I've experienced this massive fear-based emotional reaction. Something out there is trying to kill me. What is it? So that I can deal with it appropriately. Quick answer, the aircraft is trying to kill me. Let's go with that for now. Now, when I say for now, I'm talking, this is second number 2, maybe. Probably quicker than that. Which explains, to me at least, the next bit of behaviour. The left wing drops. Why? Because it's stalled, for real. What's the pilot's response? To roll the control wheel to the right in an effort to raise the left wing. When that doesn't work, he applies right rudder. This is absolutely the wrong thing to do. We know this on an intellectual basis. I am willing to bet that that pilot knew that in his human brain at the time. Those of us who are interested in human factors, though, when we observe behaviour that's gone wrong, we need to go beyond simply saying, well, that didn't work, we should not do that. We need to actually ask ourselves, why did they think that that was right? What was it about those circumstances that compelled that behaviour? Because on some level it must have made sense. Now, to me, for a pilot flying an aeroplane with the stall warner going off, this is obviously a completely incorrect action. But if you characterise this pilot as now basically a primate, in fear, wrestling with a threat to his life, well, this makes a lot more sense. I'm going to take control of this and I'm going to bend it to my will, essentially. Of course, it's not working. What's the chimp brain's response? More stress and a further increase in anxiety. This further increases the demand for resources over here on the chimp brain side. There's nowhere else for them to come from except from the input. And we have seen accidents other than this, where inputs coming from other sources, the co-pilot, air traffic control, even the aircraft itself with its audible cautions and warnings, are not being acted on by the pilot. And I strongly suspect that this is the reason. Even the basic functioning of the input is now compromised by the increasing demand for resource from the chimp brain. So now, of course, when the stick pusher fires, snatching the control column out of the pilot's hands, this is just more evidence for the aircraft is trying to kill me. I must seize hold of the control column, pull it back sharply over to the right, apply right rudder, and see if I can't fight my way out of this. At this point, the chimp brain has utterly overwhelmed the operation. The input and the human brain are nowhere. Now, it's possible that the aircraft was recoverable at this point, maybe, though perhaps unlikely. But I want to submit that the psychological state of this pilot has now gone beyond the point of recovery. And 26 seconds after the stall warner went off, the aircraft crashed and killed everyone on board. Often when I start talking about emotions and feelings, there's a risk that that talk gets sidelined, that they get maligned or belittled. But we wouldn't do that with thunderstorms. Thunderstorms we recognise as naturally occurring phenomena that are not inherently bad, but they need to be respected and they need to be understood and they need to be managed. They also, like feelings and emotions, can bring down aircraft. So, we're looking for a way to enable pilots to manage their emotional reactions and produce more helpful behaviour. There's a parallel there, interestingly, with the realm of psychotherapy, with the treatment of certain mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. Manage your client's emotional reactions to enable behaviour that is more helpful to the client. One such technique is called mindfulness. Now, mindfulness has its roots in Eastern philosophy, Buddhist meditation, that sort of thing. And when I say that, people start occasionally to get a bit nervous. They think I'm going to start talking about being one with the universe and your spirituality, and I might even get out bongos and maybe some quiche. I'm not. Now, if those things work for you, great, keep doing them. I like to think of the electrochemical activity going on in the brain. The brain is an organ of the body. We can learn to do different things with our hands and our feet. We can learn different behaviours which influence the way in which our heart and our lungs and our liver work. It stands to reason we can learn different ways to make our brain function in a way that works better for us. Mindfulness in aviation is not an entirely new concept. There are people out there. This is Carl Ison from the US who founded Mindful Aviator. Go and check out the website. He approaches it more in a kind of stress management / pilot well-being way, although that is definitely connected to what we're talking about here. But there's also this from the Journal of Aviation Psychology, looking at the impact of mindfulness training on stress in pilots. And what they found was that mindfulness training alleviates some of the physiological stress response. The physiological stress response, that's what we're talking about here, the adrenaline and the cortisol going into the body. What mindfulness is, it's a series of exercises and informal practices that teach us the art, the knack really, of being able to pay attention to our present reality as it really is, and without casting judgment. Much of our mental activity in the modern world is given over to forecasting into the future or thinking about the past, or indeed being anywhere at all other than where we are right now with what's happening. So potentially this is a boon to all of us, but it's certainly a potential boon to a pilot engaged in an upset, because mindfulness teaches us two things. One is awareness. Being aware of what's really going on in the present moment, not just in terms of my exterior surroundings, but actually what's going on internally as well. Being aware of your own mind, being aware of the sensations going on in your own body.
People say, oh, it's silly to get scared because I know that it's fine. No, it's like fear is irrational, by definition. There may be something to be scared of, but it's not inspired by a logical thought process. Yes. You don't think to yourself, I must now be scared. No. It's just it happens. It happens. So I can know that everything's perfectly fine. But I still am very aware of feeling scared.
The first step to being able to manage a startle reaction is noticing that you've had one. One of the challenges that we've got is that everyone's fear-based startle reaction is a little bit different. It will manifest itself physically, but whereas it might be a tension in the neck for one, or sweaty palms for another, it might be a feeling of nausea or a punch to the gut or a sharp intake of breath or something like that. But once you know what your own startle response is like, you can then become aware of what your body is going through. Now, this might sound like a stretch, but imagine for a moment a pilot suddenly finding him or herself in an unusual attitude or even a full-blown upset and saying, I am aware of the attitude of the aircraft. I am aware that I have had an emotional reaction right now because I sense the feelings going on both in my mind and my body. And the other thing mindfulness teaches us, acceptance. This is even more of a stretch, I would suggest, because most of us instinctively, if we're going to be involved in an unusual attitude in an aircraft, i.e. one we haven't deliberately caused, would think this is a bad situation, one I need to get out of. But remember, that's an emotional response. I'm not saying emotion has no place on the flight deck, but in this moment we need to manage our automatic animal responses because we don't want to be animals right now. We need to be human being pilots attempting to regain control of the aircraft. Being able then to accept my present reality as not bad, also as not good, as merely what it is, could also be a real asset. And again, that would also apply internally.
Okay. Heading all right, but I'm noticing the new flyer, the early stages. Turn right, take us down the beach. Sorry. Right, you're just doing a nose high recovery. This is where ego comes in, and I am embarrassed. Now I want you to try and not be embarrassed. Yeah. Because all it is motion sickness. It's got nothing to do with manliness, No, again, it's a perfectly natural, sensible, evolved response to this is what it is.
My emotional reaction that I just had. That's okay. It's normal. It is to be expected. Even the behaviour I just exhibited, which is not perhaps the behaviour I wanted to exhibit, nonetheless, it is what it is. It is what just happened. It's a way of recognising and accepting your emotional reactions, even your emotional behaviours, but parking them to one side briefly to re-engage with what's really going on. Now, still some people are not prepared to come with me on that spiritual journey, and frankly I can't blame them. I struggle with it as well, but I like science, and so do the people at the Netherlands Aerospace Centre, the NLR, Dutch answer to NASA, who investigated the Startle problem and came up with a potential solution, a management technique for pilots. Because this is aviation, they gave it a 3-letter acronym. They called it ROC, the ROC. In this case, ROC stands for relax, observe, confirm. First things first, recognising that I have been startled, I'm going to take 1, 2 or 3 seconds deliberately to make myself relax before I do anything else. This is a step beyond the old instructional technique of sit on your hands and don't do anything. It's recognising, for example, how the aircraft seat feels pressing into the small of your back, taking one deep breath in and out and recognising again the sensations that are associated with that. We're doing 2 things there. One, we are managing the physical symptoms going on in the body, but we're also bringing ourselves back to the reality of the present moment. Then we observe the data that the instruments are presenting us, we observe what's going on in the real world, but only observe objectively. This isn't a bad or good situation just at the moment, we're just observing what's gone on, and then we vocalise that by confirming with the co-pilot. It is in effect a mini mindful meditation, if you like. Merely a means to manage our emotional reactions before we then re-engage our human brain faculties and deal with the problem at hand. So, that's a technical scientific. We've also had spiritual. If that doesn't work for you, let's make it even more basic. What fundamentally is the startle reflex? The startle reflex is your chimp brain detecting an imminent threat and shouting at the top of its voice, "What the f*** was that?" Now, I've used the swear word deliberately for a couple of reasons. One, I wish to convey that this is not a polite inquiry on the part of your chimp brain. This is a visceral emotional reaction. But the other thing is that swearing seems to come from a different bit of the brain to normal everyday language. There's been some studies that suggest that people who swear their way through painful and stressful circumstances actually can endure them for longer than those that don't. For the record, though, that only works if swearing is not an ordinary everyday part of your language. But for those involved in a startling event, one of the symptoms of that startle might very well be a sudden and involuntary expletive. So what does the brain do after that? Well, we've seen this in the case of Colgan Air 3407. It casts around looking for the source of the threat. What is it that's caused that emotional reaction? What's going to kill me? What, in other words, is the problem? And we pour all our energies into discerning the threat to our lives and dealing with this bad situation. But as we've seen, that can be somewhat counterproductive. An alternative would be not that we can avoid the startle reflex. It's called a reflex for a reason. If you accidentally touch a hot stove, your hand will fly backwards, and there's very little you can do to stop that from happening. Same with the startle reflex. If you get startled, what the f*** was that will happen. But maybe we can get in there just ahead of the what's the problem. We start going down the what's the problem route and we say, hang on a minute, stop. What's still working? What have we got that is actually good right now? And it doesn't have to be something that we could use to solve our problem. It is literally about managing those emotional reactions. Pick 3 things. The engines are still working, the tanks are full of fuel, the radio is tuned to the correct frequency, co-pilot's still alive, it's a nice day, whatever works, 2 or 3 things that just bring us back to reality and indeed focus on the positive. Because by focusing on the positive, we kind of remove those resources away from the adrenaline-fueled chimp brain and bring them back to the positivity-inclined human brain where we need them to be, which then enables us to deal with this surprising situation in which we find ourselves. Now that is an important point, because for a commercial pilot at the very least, an unusual attitude, an upset, will always be a surprise. It should be a surprise, because hopefully you've done everything you need to prevent it from happening. At Ultimate High, you are given the practical experience of recovering from an unusual attitude in a genuine aircraft as opposed to a simulator, and you experience the forces and the sensations that go with that.
So as I get about there, if I just push till I'm light in my seat, yeah, that amount of push, yes, I weigh half as much, or about half a G. No, I don't feel light in my seat. No, I feel the opposite.
This has an added psychological benefit as well. Remember that a startle is fear-based. The fear is far more acute when it's something completely new and you don't know what's going on. The advantage of on-aircraft UPRT, like happens here at Ultimate High, is that it introduces your chimp brain to the experience of an unusual attitude whilst being simultaneously airborne. You get to experience what that looks like whilst you're actually above the ground. It's like a little inoculation. It means that when the upset happens, if it should happen to you in your commercial career, it will definitely be a surprise, but maybe because you've experienced something just a little bit like it before, that fear factor is reduced a little bit. That means that those resources are no longer required quite so much by the chimp brain. It will probably be a bit scary still, but maybe not quite so scary. We've got resources now available to our human brain. Maybe not quite enough to deal with the complex issue of trying to fly an aeroplane, but enough that we can make those efforts necessary to regain our human brain faculties and eventually give ourselves the tools that we need to deal with this new problem. In other words, and put more simply, an unusual attitude, an aircraft upset, will always be a surprise. But hopefully, thanks to the training here, it won't be a full-blown startle.